Every dictator in history started with a promise. Every tyrant came to power offering something the people wanted: security, prosperity, equality, justice. Adolf Hitler promised to restore German greatness. Vladimir Lenin promised bread, land, and peace. Mao Zedong promised liberation from feudalism. Hugo Chavez promised to lift the poor out of poverty. And in every single case, the people who accepted those promises woke up to find that they had traded their freedom for a cage. The promises were broken, the power remained, and the people had no way to take it back. You might think that could never happen here. You might think that democracy protects us, that constitutions protect us, that the rule of law protects us, and you would be partly right. These institutions do matter, but they are not self-enforcing. A constitution is a piece of paper. It protects your freedom only if the people who hold power choose to respect it, or if the system is designed so cleverly that power is constrained even when those who hold it wish it weren't. The question of how to limit government power is not abstract political philosophy. It is the most urgent practical question any free society faces, because the one thing we know from history, the one thing that is beyond dispute, is that power tends to grow, government tends to expand, freedom tends to contract, unless we actively, deliberately, and intelligently resist that tendency. Let me tell you how. The first and most fundamental principle is this: concentrate on the rules of the game, not on the players. The great mistake people make in politics is believing that the solution is to elect better people. If only we had the right president, the right Congress, the right party in power, everything would be fine. This is a dangerous illusion. It doesn't matter how wise, how virtuous, how well-intentioned the people in power are. What matters is the system within which they operate. What matters are the incentives they face, the constraints that bind them, the rules that limit what they can do. James Madison understood this better than almost anyone. In Federalist Number 51, he wrote words that should be engraved above every government building in the world. He said that if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And if angels were to govern men, no controls on government would be necessary. The great challenge of designing a government is to first enable the government to control the governed, and then to oblige it to control itself. Madison and the other framers of the American Constitution designed the most ingenious system of limited government the world had ever seen: separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, a Bill of Rights, enumerated powers. Every one of these features was designed to make it difficult for government to act, to create friction and obstacles in the path of government power, to ensure that no single person or faction could dominate. And for a long time, it worked remarkably well. For the first century and a half of the American Republic, government at all levels consumed perhaps 10 to 15% of national income. Individual freedom was extensive. Economic liberty was largely unrestricted. People were free to start businesses, enter professions, move across state lines, and keep most of what they earned. America became the most prosperous nation on earth, not because of government, but because government was limited enough to allow the creative energies of free people to flourish. But something changed. Starting in the early 20th century and accelerating dramatically from the 1930s onward, the constitutional constraints began to erode. The federal government expanded far beyond anything the framers envisioned or intended. Today, government at all levels consumes roughly 40% of national income. Federal regulations fill hundreds of thousands of pages. The government tells you what wages you must pay, what products you can sell, what you can build on your own property, what health insurance you must buy, and increasingly what you can and cannot say. How did this happen? How did a system specifically designed to limit government power fail to do so? Understanding the answer is essential to finding the remedy. The erosion happened through several mechanisms. The first was the reinterpretation of the Constitution by the courts. The Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, was originally understood narrowly. It meant that Congress could prevent states from erecting barriers to trade between states. But over the course of the 20th century, the Supreme Court expanded this clause until it became a general license for Congress to regulate virtually any economic activity. If a farmer grows wheat on his own land to feed his own chickens, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress can regulate that activity because it affects interstate commerce. By that logic, there is nothing Congress cannot regulate. The enumerated powers doctrine, the idea that the federal government can do only those things specifically listed in the Constitution, became a dead letter. The second mechanism was the growth of the administrative state. Congress discovered that it could delegate its legislative power to executive agencies. Instead of writing specific laws, Congress passes vague statutes and then allows bureaucracies to write the detailed regulations. These agencies, staffed by unelected officials who cannot be easily removed, now exercise legislative, executive, and judicial power combined. They write rules, enforce them, and adjudicate disputes about them. This is precisely the concentration of power that the framers designed the system to prevent. The third mechanism was the change in public attitudes. The Great Depression shattered public confidence in free markets and created a demand for government action. The New Deal established the principle that the federal government was responsible for economic welfare. The Great Society expanded this into a comprehensive welfare state. Each crisis, each perceived failure of the market led to a new expansion of government power, and each expansion created constituencies that fought to preserve and enlarge it. Programs once created are almost never eliminated. Agencies once established almost never shrink. The ratchet turns in one direction only. The fourth mechanism was the power of concentrated interests. I've spoken about this before in the context of the tyranny of the status quo. The benefits of government programs are typically concentrated among a small, well-organized group, while the costs are spread across millions of taxpayers. Sugar producers benefit enormously from sugar quotas and subsidies. Each taxpayer pays only a few dollars more. The sugar producers have every incentive to lobby, to contribute to campaigns, to fight for their program. The individual taxpayer has almost no incentive to fight against it. Multiply this by thousands of programs, and you have a government that grows relentlessly because the incentives driving its growth are far stronger than the incentives constraining it. So what can be done if the original constitutional design is proven insufficient? What additional measures might work? Let me propose several reforms, each of which addresses a specific failure in the current system. First, a constitutional amendment to limit government spending. I have long advocated for an amendment that would require the federal government to balance its budget, or more precisely, that would limit total federal spending to a fixed percentage of national income. Such an amendment would impose a hard constraint on the growth of government. Politicians could still argue about how to spend the money, which programs to fund and which to cut, but the total would be fixed. This would force the trade-offs that the current system allows politicians to evade. Today, when a new program is proposed, the cost can be hidden through deficit spending or inflation. Under a spending limit, every new program would require cutting an existing one. That changes the political dynamic entirely. Second, a constitutional amendment to limit the power of taxation. The 16th Amendment, which authorized the federal income tax, opened the door to unlimited government growth by giving the federal government access to an essentially unlimited revenue source. A constitutional limit on tax rates or a requirement for a supermajority to raise taxes would constrain the revenue side and thereby constrain spending. Third, reform of the regulatory process. The delegation of legislative power to administrative agencies should be sharply curtailed. Congress should be required to vote on major regulations before they take effect. No regulation that imposes costs above a specified threshold should have the force of law unless both houses of Congress have approved it. This would restore democratic accountability to the regulatory process and make it much harder for bureaucracies to expand their power without public consent. Fourth, decentralization. One of the most powerful mechanisms for limiting government is competition between governments. When power is concentrated in a single national government, citizens have no escape. But when power is dispersed among 50 states and thousands of local governments, citizens can vote with their feet. If one state taxes too heavily or regulates too oppressively, people and businesses can move to another state. This competition constrains government far more effectively than any constitutional provision. The framers understood this, which is why they created a federal system. But over the past century, power has been centralized in Washington, reducing the competitive pressure on government. Restoring genuine federalism, returning power to the states, would be one of the most effective ways to limit government. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, school choice. This may seem like an odd inclusion in a discussion of limiting government power, but think about it. The government runs the school system that educates the citizens who will vote on the size and scope of government. Is it any surprise that government schools tend to produce citizens who are favorably disposed toward government? School choice, whether through vouchers, tax credits, or charter schools, would break the government monopoly on education and allow parents to choose schools that teach their children to think critically and independently. A citizenry that is well educated and capable of critical thinking is the ultimate check on government power. Sixth, sound money. I have argued extensively for a monetary rule that would prevent the government from using inflation as a hidden tax. When the government can create money at will, it can finance its activities without the explicit consent of the taxpayers. This is one of the most insidious forms of government power because it is invisible to most citizens. A constitutional requirement for sound money, whether through a monetary growth rule, a return to some form of commodity standard, or simply an independent central bank bound by clear rules, would close this back door to unlimited government. Now let me anticipate the objections. People will say that these constraints are too rigid, that government needs flexibility to respond to crises, that emergencies require emergency powers. And there is a grain of truth in this, but consider the historical record. Emergency powers once granted are almost never returned. The income tax was introduced as a temporary measure to finance the Civil War. It became permanent. Wage and price controls were introduced as temporary wartime measures. They were retained and expanded. The Federal Reserve was created to prevent banking panics. It became the engine of inflation. The pattern is always the same. The emergency justifies the expansion. The expansion becomes permanent, and the next emergency justifies further expansion. This is why rules matter more than discretion. Yes, rules are rigid, that is their virtue, not their defect. The whole point of a constitution is to be rigid, to prevent the government from doing things that seem expedient in the moment, but are destructive in the long run. We don't allow the government to suspend free speech during a crisis, even though there are always arguments for doing so. We shouldn't allow the government to suspend fiscal discipline during a crisis either. People will also say that limiting government means accepting social problems that government could solve. What about the poor? What about the sick? What about those who cannot help themselves? These are legitimate concerns, but they rest on a false premise, the premise that government is the only or the best means of addressing these problems. In a free society, voluntary institutions, families, churches, charities, mutual aid societies, community organizations address these problems far more effectively and humanely than government ever can. Before the welfare state, America had an extensive network of voluntary institutions that provided for those in need. These institutions were accountable to their donors and to the people they served. They could distinguish between those who genuinely needed help and those who were taking advantage. They provided help in ways that encouraged self-reliance rather than dependency. The welfare state crowded out these institutions and replaced them with impersonal bureaucracies that treat people as categories rather than individuals, that create dependency rather than independence, and that consume enormous resources in administrative overhead. Limiting government does not mean abandoning the vulnerable. It means finding better ways to help them, ways that preserve their dignity, encourage their independence, and harness the generosity and creativity of free people rather than the coercive power of the state. Let me close with what I consider the most important point of all. The ultimate limit on government power is an informed and vigilant citizenry. No constitutional provision, no institutional design, no clever mechanism can substitute for citizens who understand the value of freedom and are willing to defend it. The framers of the Constitution gave us a remarkable system, but they knew it was not enough. Benjamin Franklin, when asked what kind of government the Constitutional Convention had created, replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Those last 5 words are the most important. If you can keep it. Keeping it requires that each generation understands why limited government matters, not just as an abstract principle, but as a practical necessity for prosperity, justice, and human dignity. It requires that citizens understand the insidious ways in which government grows, the concentrated interests that drive its expansion, the emergencies that justify its overreach, the good intentions that pave the road to serfdom. It requires, above all, a healthy skepticism toward government, not cynicism, not hostility, but the recognition that government is that force should be used sparingly, and that those who wield it should be watched carefully and constrained firmly. Power is like fire. It is useful when contained. It is destructive when it spreads. The task of a free people is to keep the fire in the fireplace and to be vigilant that it does not escape. Every law, every regulation, every tax, every program is a piece of kindling. Some are necessary, many are not. And if we are not careful, if we let the kindling pile up without limit, the fire will eventually consume the house. The house, in this case, is your freedom. And once it burns down, it is very, very difficult to rebuild.